H.P. Lovecraft, Cosmic Horror, and Cthulhu. Hi, I'm Gary Lovisi, and this time we're going to take a look at the works of H.P. Lovecraft and the paperbacks, vintage paperbacks of H.P. Lovecraft. This is only a few of them. You can see some of them. This is an issue of Paperback Parade from, actually from 2000, number 54, which was H.P. Lovecraft vintage paperback issue. It showed some of the books and a lot of the books inside. This is an old issue from 20 years ago. That was the H.P. Lovecraft issue. A lot of the books here, some of them by Lovecraft and some by others. You'll see I'm wearing a Necronomicon t-shirt. This is a Necronomicon paperback. There's other books that are Lovecraftian, and then all of these are different Lovecraft books. First of all, I'd just like to say that Lovecraft was he was born August 20th, 1890. So happy birthday, H.P. Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He was born in 1890, August 20th, and he died on March 15th, 1937. He was 46 years old. Very young. He died very young. And he died in poverty. With all the stories that he wrote and all the that were published in the pulp magazines and Weird Tales and other places. He's a very popular author. He died in poverty at 46 years old, young. Lovecraft was an interesting person. He created the genre, I guess you would call it, of cosmic horror. And the Cthulhu mythos was part of that. Basically, it was a very, he had a lot of hang-ups. And some of his hang-ups were about, he was very paranoid. And he also was into the occult and supernatural, but he did not believe in the occult or supernatural, but he used it for his stories. And the paranoid visions that he had kind of were, he looked at man's place in the universe. He was basically a philosopher who looked at history and to try to get some understanding of events and meaning of life in his stories. Not to get too much into it, but that the paranoia was a part of his, a big part of his, in his stories, because he saw humans as being used as pawns by other worldly beings, ancient aliens that lived deep beneath the ground, that were asleep or had been imprisoned, entombed in the past, dim, dark past of man's memory, or aliens, great old ones that were that came from beyond the stars, and all of these super alien races that used men or man as and women as pawns, and every once in a while somebody like one of his poor kind of heroes, or poor guys like Charles Dexter Ward or Randolph Carter or one of these people would stumble upon something strange in a strange book, maybe the Necronomicon, or strange people. They may take a trip to Innsmouth, which is a village that he made up, and in the village it was always like kind of inbred, very secluded, very strange people in this village of Innsmouth. And one of his protagonists went to the village, and he's just like, what's going on here with these very strange people? And again, it was kind of his paranoia, but it fed well into his horror and into the stories. And well, he also created all kinds of, he created the Cthulhu mythos, which was the elder gods that were trying to come back to reassert their once dominance over humanity and over the earth. And all those stories in that cycle are very popular. And was so popular that there was a Lovecraft circle of writers, many writers who wrote Cthulhu mythos and Lovecraftian type of stories, and he encouraged that. He liked that. Um, he was influenced by Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, so many authors, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, and he influenced a lot of authors. Stephen King, very much so, and also a lot of authors. Robert Bloch was a 14-year-old boy fan who wrote to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft wrote him back, and talking about horror, talking about different stories. Carl Jacobi, Donald Wandry, August Derleth, of which we'll talk about in a little bit, and many others. Henry Kuttner, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith I also already mentioned. So there's so many people that were in the Lovecraft circle of writers who wrote stories in his type of horror, that cosmic horror of alien beings that are so powerful and so evil and so intense that and man is so small, so insignificant, and of course it's like we're dealing with things that we don't understand, and it's barely even can comprehend. So Lovecraft did a lot of these things. He also brought together some really interesting tropes for his stories. The most famous is this the Necronomicon. Well, this is not the actual book, the Necronomicon, which was a made-up book that he wrote about. This is a paperback from 1980 when they just Avon published it just to kind of get on the horror and Lovecraft bandwagon, because in the 80s horror was very big with Stephen King, and Stephen King in his book Danse Macabre talks about his influences by Lovecraft, among others. Magnificent book. And Necronomicon was a made-up book when it first came out. When he wrote of it it came out it was one of his stories. He mentioned it, a lost book by the mad Arab Abdul al-Jared, who wrote the book and of its dark magic, and it was so evil that it warped men's minds and drove them crazy, and he killed himself, and all of this is like all this. And so that book, anybody who even opens a page of the book will go instantly insane, and that's what he used in some of his stories, where a person would find a copy of the Necronomicon. The book never existed. The only interesting thing about it is that in the 30s, the people that were into the supernatural or into the occult, into rare books, thought it was a real book, and they actually were looking for it, and they're trying to find it, but it doesn't exist. And other authors in the Lovecraft circle used that same thing. Similar, like Henry Kuttner used a German book called, if I can pronounce this properly, Unexplickbaren Kulten, Unspeakable Cults. And that was Kuttner's version of the Necronomicon that he used in his Lovecraftian type of stories. But Lovecraft didn't only stop there. He went further. He used Innsmouth, which was a kind of a version of a Massachusetts fishing village, very remote, very weird, with weird people. He used Arkham, which was Arkham, Massachusetts, which was a made-up city. And what happened is that later on, of course, one of his biggest fans, August Derleth, started Arkham House Press and used the name Arkham. And it was specifically, he started it specifically to get the pulp stories of H.P. Lovecraft into book form, so that he could preserve them as books rather than in the old pulp magazines where they would be rotting away and stuff after a while. There's so many things with Lovecraft. Miskatonic University was a made-up university where he would have professors who somehow came upon certain documents or ancient texts, or all of it has had to do with the great old ones and all this horror. And to me, it was always great fun. It was interesting. It was cool. I read almost all the Lovecraft books, and probably a lot of the ones that were by other people, and they were always interesting and fun. The thing about Lovecraft was, like I said, he was an odd duck. He died at 46 years old, very young, and in poverty. He was a he wrote a lot of letters. Okay, there are books where you can 5-volume sets of big, thick hardcovers of Lovecraft's letters. He wrote over 100,000 letters to people, and in some cases he had foregone eating, spending money. He did not spend money on food rather than spending money on the postage to mail out the letters to people, because in those days you didn't have the internet or email or anything like you have today for communication. A lot of people communicated through the mail, and he wouldn't just write a letter like to somebody, say, thanks, I'm glad you liked my story, I hope you like the next one, see you next week. He would write a 5 or 10 page letter going into detail about the philosophy and the history of certain aspects of his story, how this story that he wrote came to be, why he used certain ideas. He would also have people that he would comment on their stories, and he would even help other writers with stories and horror. So he was always very in communication with other writers, all these writers, and helped a lot of them. He had a lot of hang-ups, I would say, I guess I should call it. But he was an interesting fellow, and his stories are all based on that paranoid vision that he had, with his philosophy of what evil was and how it was relentless, and also his sense of history, mixing history and legend and myth with horror, and he put it all together and into some great stories. Some of his stories are really scary, some of them are just really interesting and fun. He lived and died in Providence. He was born and died in Providence, Rhode Island, but he lived in Brooklyn for a while. He near where I live in Brooklyn. He lived in the Red Hook section. He lived also in other areas, and one of his stories, The Horror at Red Hook, is based on that area of Brooklyn where he lived. So there's a lot about him, and now we're just going to show some of the books. These are a few of the books from my collection of Lovecraft, and there's a bunch. So there's different series. Valentine Books in the 70s published a group of books with John Holmes cover art. John Holmes, not the porno actor, but another a very good artist of horror. And we'll take a look at them now. There's At the Mountains of Madness. These are all stories. This is probably Brown Jenkin, who was from Rats in the Walls, who was a witch's familiar. The Lovecraftian stories deal with elder gods, ancient gods, but also witches, demons, monsters, creatures, ancient beings, beings from beyond the stars, everything that you could think of, every kind of horror. So that's At the Mountains of Madness. Another version of it. The Shuttered Room. Again, these are old John Holmes covers. And The Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos. There were Volume 1 and Volume 2.
This guy's into big heads.
Yeah. I think this is an illustration for Cool Air, one of his really good horror stories. Next one is The Tomb and The Lurking Fear. I don't know if I have complete sets of these. I might be missing one or two. I have so many of them that it's like hard to keep track sometimes. Beagle Books, Beagle Boxer Books, did a series of also Lovecraft reprints.
I apologize for this noise. This is ridiculous.
Yes, I apologize for this noise. It is ridiculous. They are doing construction outside, and maybe they'll dig up a Lovecraftian creature or something, but I hope not.
That would be my luck.
That would be our luck. Next one is, these are Beagle Boxers. These are also, were a imprint of Valentine books. These are the Arkham, they call them the Arkham editions. It was
Talk a little louder.
Arkham editions. These were numbered. They were in the series. That's The Tomb, giant eyeball. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The Horror in the Museum by H.P. Lovecraft and others. The others were a whole group of people. August Derleth, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long. I mean, there's so many authors that were in the Lovecraft circle who wrote Cthulhu mythos stories and also who wrote stories in the Lovecraft style, or that kind of cosmic horror. The Mask of Cthulhu by August Derleth. This is a story of eldritch horror based on the concepts of H.P. Lovecraft. So these are August Derleth stories. Again, The Trail of Cthulhu, more stories by August Derleth, Cthulhu mythos. Another Beagle Boxer, or Beagle book, At the Mountains of Madness, Tales of the Cthulhu mythos, Beagle Boxer number 2, Tales of the Cthulhu mythos, volume 1, The Shuttered Room, and H.P. Lovecraft with August Derleth, The Lurker at the Threshold. So these are all different horror stories. Some of them were finished by August Derleth from notes or partial stories that were begun by Lovecraft but weren't completed. Like I say, he died young, 46 years old, and it was kind of a shock for a lot of people, I think, that he did die, even though I don't think that he took care of himself very well. And he had a lot of problems, but his stories that weren't complete were completed by other writers, and Derleth was one of them. And a lot of them were published in these paperbacks. Some of them these paperbacks reprint Arkham House books, the hardcovers that were published started in the late 30s, I guess 39 for the first Arkham House, and then throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And those Arkham House are very, very collectible, especially the Lovecraft volumes. Some of them are very expensive, but the paperbacks are cool. Paperbacks still have great cover art, and the paperbacks have all the stories, and these are the great stories to read. Next, we're going to move these down, and we're going to look at some later Valentines from the 70s. Lovecraft and August Derleth, The Survivor, and others. H.P. Lovecraft, The Doom That Came to Sarnath. And this is a wraparound cover. Really bizarre cover art. I think Gallardo did these covers. The next one is Fungi from Yuggoth and Other Poems. If you're into fungi. Okay, and that was a wraparound cover also. Very strange, bizarre, nightmarish images. Lovecraft and Others. This is edited by Lynn Carter. The Spawn of Cthulhu. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Lovecraft was also a very big fan of Lord Dunsany, who was a great fantasy writer, and Lovecraft wrote this in the Dunsany style, which is kind of very different than all his other stuff. This is the Valentine horror series, The Lurker at the Threshold. I think that Murray Tinkleman is the cover artist. And then The Doom That Came to Sarnath and Other Stories. A lot of Lovecraft's books were reprinted in England by Panther Books. And so we have Panther. These British ones were, of course I can't find the date, from 1970, around there, late 60s, early 70s. The Haunter of the Dark and Other Tales. The Lurking Fear and Other Stories. Again, these are all mostly collections of his pulp horror stories. In certain cases, at the Mountains of Madness, or the case of Charles Dexter Ward, they're short novels that were published separately. So here you have a case of Charles Dexter Ward, a short novel that was published by itself. The Horror in the Burying Ground, H.P. Lovecraft and Others. Nice guy coming out of the grave there. And here you go, the Panther from 1963, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, an earlier version of this. And another Panther, Dagon and Other Macabre Tales, H.P. Lovecraft. So you have a group of some of the British ones. In the 1980s, Del Rey Books began reprinting Lovecraft, and they actually had a series of books with Michael Whalen cover art. He was a hot cover artist at that time in the 80s, and he did a series of covers for the Lovecraft books. And this is At the Mountains of Madness. These are Del Rey books from 1980s. The Tomb and Other Stories. I'm not sure if this is Whalen. That definitely is. I'm not sure about this. I think he did all the covers in this series. The Doom That Came to Sarnath. The Lurking Fear. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. By now you're seeing that, becoming familiar with some of the titles of some of the books. And The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, that version. Now we're gonna move these over a little bit, and we're gonna go and look at some other books. A lot of movies were based on Lovecraft's books and stories, and one of the most famous is Reanimator. This is the movie tie-in for Reanimator.
My favorite.
That's your favorite?
My one and only
favorite. Yeah. And there was a sequel to this, and there were other Lovecraft or other movies made from Lovecraft stories. None of them, they don't come to mind so much to me, because I don't think they were very good. I don't recall any that really stood out to me. Reanimator was pretty good though.
I never read it. I just saw the movie.
The Watchers Out of Time. This is a Carolyn Graff. The Survivor and Other Stories. The Last Rare Stories of a Master Craftsman in Horror. Lovecraft with August Derleth. That's a Valentine book. The Lurker at the Threshold. British Panther. Mr. George and Other Odd Persons, Belmont series. This is by August Derleth, and it's based on Lovecraft's horror stories. There's next one is a couple of Lancer books. The Dunwich Horror, and that one was from 1969. And this is another version, later version, Lancer Books, Dunwich Horror. The Belmont did two versions of the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Remarkable science fantasy of an extraordinary man's obsession and of a body stripped to the soul. And this is first Belmont printing, and then the second Belmont printing. Different cover, but similar. What was happening to his face? There's a lot of the Lovecraft stories. People go through transformations. They become possessed, or they become enamored of black magic or evil or certain things, and there's a transformation that takes place. They become monsters. They become creatures. Another Valentine horror. Strange. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Murray Tinkleman cover art. A Grafton, British, H.P. Lovecraft Omnibus number 3, The Haunter of the Dark, with a truly unbelievable cover by Tim White. Amazing, gruesome, grotesque cover. And The Mask of Cthulhu by August Derleth. Supernatural Terror in the Great Tradition of H.P. Lovecraft. This is another Grafton book with a Tim White cover. And The Trail of Cthulhu, another Grafton book. August Derleth's stories based on Lovecraft's horror with a Tim White cover. These Tim White covers are pretty nice. Next thing is, again, I'm going to mention some of the books. Well, there's a nice council book, British council book from the 60s, The Mask of Cthulhu, which is, again, August Derleth. There's frog creatures, monsters. And there's a bunch of books that are about Lovecraft, or have Lovecraftian stories in them, which I'm going to show you now. There's quite a little pile over here. Lovecraft biography. This is a Valentine book from the, I guess in the 70s, by Elsprague de Camp. Murray Tinkleman cover art. Lovecraft, A Look Behind the Cthulhu Mythos. This is a Valentine book from 1972 by Lynn Carter. His version of talking about Lovecraft's writing. There's The Disciples of Cthulhu, edited by Edward P. Berglund, which is Door Book number 213 from 1976. And I don't know who did the cover art on this. I should, but it's got newer stories, original anthology of people writing Lovecraftian horror stories. Lovecraft, A Look Behind the Cthulhu Mythos by Lynn Carter. We already have that, but this is a later version with new cover art. This is the second printing, new cover art. Robert E. Howard was creator of Conan, and we did a previous video on him and his books. But he wrote also in the some horror stories in the Cthulhu Mythos story cycle, and had a bunch of stories. And what they did was they Bean Books in the 90s published, edited by David Drake, Cthulhu, The Mythos, and Kindred Horrors by Robert E. Howard. So these are all Robert E. Howard pulp stories that have to do with the Cthulhu mythos in some way, or tangentially, or specifically are Cthulhu stories. Dorr comes back again years later with, I don't know what number this one is. It's not numbered. It's Cthulhu Reigns, edited by Daryl Schweitzer. And again, this is new stories written by new writers in the Cthulhu.
Certainly getting that Cthulhu money's
Oh,
worth.
there's so many books. I haven't even, honestly.
If this was Rocky, it'd be Rocky 75.
Put the camera on. Honestly, I haven't even. I just wetting the surface. There are so many books. There's Robert Price published so many magazines of Lovecraftian horror, Cthulhu mythos stories, and articles. Chaosium Press, a lot of trade paperbacks. There's so many books of Lovecraftian horror and Cthulhu mythos stories. So this just wets the surface, and but just to give you an idea. And the next book is another Dorr book. It's number 1041, Miskatonic University, 13 terrifying tales told out of school by scholars of the dark, frightening, well-versed in the Lovecraftian arts, edited by Martin Greenberg and Robert Weinberg. This is very scarce. My copy is signed by Weinberg. Again, Miskatonic University was a university that Lovecraft made up, and just to kind of put some verisimilitude into his stories. So he'd have a professor who was a famous professor at Miskatonic University who lived in Arkham, Massachusetts, and maybe took a side trip down a lonely road and found the town of Innsmouth and the strange people there, and somehow he came upon a copy of the Necronomicon, and that's all bad stuff. That's all he's going to get you in trouble. So that's some bad stuff in the Lovecraftian universe to deal with some of these things. But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, and the stories are great. The other thing is just a few more books. I showed you this Necronomicon. It's not the real book, of course. They just published it in the 80s as a kind of a thing because it was they're using the name. The book does not. It's not. Well, this book
is it
exists.
blank?
No, it's a book about supernatural and astrology and stuff, but it's not. They basically took another book and they just put this title on it, and it has nothing really to do with, it's not the book, because the book doesn't exist. The other, there's a few other interesting things. The wizard books that are inspired one way or another by Lovecraft. The Wizard of Lovecraft's Cafe by Simon Hawke. This is Nicholas Yermakov. He wrote a series, and this is Lovecraft's Cafe. It's basically a little Lovecraftian feel to it, and he uses his name, but it's it's not really such a Lovecraft story. Michael Shea, The Color Out of Time. This is a Dore book, 566, I think, and has Ken Kelly cover. Michael Shea wrote some very good Lovecraftian and some Jack Vance inspired novels. Really good stuff. There's a Doctor Who and the Seeds of Doom by Philip Hinchcliffe, which is Target paperback. And here you have Doctor Who and the Lovecraftian monster. The monsters are always these kind of squid creatures, octopus things with tentacles all over the place, and big giant eyes, and all kinds of gushy, squeezy, squirty, slimy creatures, and they're disgusting and they're scary. Another one is Dagon by Fred Chappell. This is cover art by Peter Karras, and this is kind of based on Lovecraft. It's a pretty good story. And the next one is actually the last one. There's two versions here of The Great White Space by Basil Copper, and there's the American edition from Manor. That's the first edition, and the British edition, which is much nicer, by Sphere Books. That great cover art, great demon monster cover art, almost right out of Alien. This looks like The Fly or something. Something happened to, again, the transformation of a Lovecraftian person who deals with the black arts or the supernatural, the occult, and gets involved in a little bit over his head with the transformation that happens, and then this is like the creature, and so that's some of the a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft, and you got that HBO show Lovecraft Country, which is probably going to be a pretty popular show. It should be interesting. Lovecraft did have a lot of hang-ups. He was paranoid. He was a very nervous person, and it comes through in his books. But all of that enhances the fascination of his horror, because that comes through in the stories and of his characters. And you really, when you're reading his stuff, it's like, wow, this is like really wild stuff. Very different from the 80s horror that Stephen King and others promulgated at that time. Stephen King and other horror writers brought horror down to right to the level of common people. Horror was in Christine in a car, or in a dog, Cujo, or in just going to the supermarket. That you could encounter great evil, great horror, or at a hotel, great horror. Lovecraft really, instead of having it, the horror kind of in a small place, he expanded it to galaxy-wide cosmic horror and mind-blowing horror. And when it works, it's really good. So I just want to say happy birthday, H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He would be his birthday would be August 20th. And I hope you enjoyed this look at Lovecraft and some of his vintage paperbacks. If you did, give us a thumbs up, a like, and share it with somebody, and subscribe. Let people. I think if you subscribe, you can to the channel here. You'll not only get updates on new videos. We do one usually every week, but also you'll see a list of all the previous videos. We've done about 140 of them already, and there's got to be something that you're interested in that mix. So,
We hope.
We hope, yes. But it's fun to do these, and I hope you enjoy them. And I want to thank you all for your support. And see you next time. Thank you.